The Arizona sun hammered the dusty square into submission. Air thick with jeers and alkali grit choked Mei Ling, the last girl on the block, her thin frame rigid against the stairs. Hope was a dead thing in her chest. Then a voice, low and rough as canyon rock, cut through the din. I offer marriage, not coin, my name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. Redstone, Arizona territory, baked under an August sun fierce enough to crack stone. The air shimmered above the rutted main street, thick with the smell of dust, unwashed bodies, horse dung, and something sharper, uglier, anticipation. It clung to the crowd gathered in the meager shade of the mercantile porch, a rough assembly of miners, cowhands, drifters, and a few stony-faced townsfolk. Their focus was a makeshift platform, 2 whiskey barrels and a warped plank, where Mr. Hendricks, the auctioneer, mopped his florid face with a stained handkerchief. Last one, gents. Prime stock, fresh off the train. Don't let this little china doll slip through your fingers. Hendricks' voice boomed, overly hearty, trying to stoke the dying embers of the crowd's fervor. The earlier sales, 3 other young Chinese women, had been swift, brutal transactions met with coarse laughter and bids shouted like curses. Now fatigue and the relentless heat were setting in, but the leering stares remained fixed on the figure beside him. Mei Ling stood perfectly still. Breathe, just breathe. The command was a silent drumbeat in her skull, the only thing holding her upright. The coarse rope binding her wrists chafed raw skin already rubbed sore during the long, terrifying journey west in a stifling boxcar. They'd been cargo then, and they were cargo now. The faded blue calico dress they'd given her hung loose, swallowing her slight frame. Dust coated her worn leather shoes, a pair meant for someone else, someone long gone. She kept her eyes fixed on a point just above the heads of the men, a crack in the adobe wall of the livery across the street. Looking down invited pity. Meeting their eyes invited worse. Inside, a cold terror warred with a smoldering defiance. Not like the others. Don't let them see you break. Her hands, hidden in the folds of the dress, were clenched so tightly her short nails bit into her palms. The memory of the train whistle screaming to the Nevada desert flashed, a sound of pure desolation, followed by the blank, terrified faces of the girls sold before her. Gone, swallowed by this harsh, alien land. Come now. She's young, strong. Look at them hands, nose work. Ain't no porcelain ornament, this one. Hendricks nudged her shoulder roughly. Mei Ling flinched, a minute tremor she couldn't suppress. But her gaze didn't waver from the crack in the wall. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Strong? Looks like a stiff breeze snapped her. Hendricks, yelled a man with tobacco-stained teeth, leaning against a hitching post. What's she good for, except maybe mending? Or warmer nights? Another voice guffawed, prompting a chorus of crude agreement. Hendricks scowled. Start the bidding, then who'll give me $10? $10 for a lifetime of service. Silence. The heat pressed down. A fly buzzed lazily around Mei Ling's face. She refused to blink it away. $10. The price of a decent saddle. Less than a good rifle. Her life. Measured in coins tossed by men who saw only her foreign eyes and small stature. $5, then. Hendricks barked, desperation creeping in. $5. Hell, $3. $2.50, drawled the tobacco-stained man, spitting a brown stream into the dust. For kitchen scrubbing. Maybe. Mei Ling's stomach clenched. Kitchen scrubbing. She knew what that really meant in the cramped, filthy quarters behind saloons or isolated mining camps. The cold terror surged, threatening to freeze her lungs. Not that. Please, not that. Hendricks opened his mouth, likely to accept a paltry sum, when a movement at the edge of the crowd caught Mei Ling's eye. A man stepped forward, parting the onlookers with a quiet, unyielding presence. He wasn't like the others. Tall, broad-shouldered beneath a worn duster coat bleached pale by the sun. He moved with the deliberate gait of someone used to distance and solitude. His face was shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, but she glimpsed a strong jaw, clean-shaven but etched with lines that spoke of sun and wind, and something deeper, older. Sadness. His eyes, when they briefly met hers as he approached the platform, were a startling clear gray, like quartz washed in a mountain stream. They held no leer, no hunger, only a profound, weary stillness. The crowd murmured, surprised. This was Thomas Kane. Everyone in Redstone knew Thomas Kane, or knew of him. The widower rancher from the High Valley, the one who kept to himself since his wife, Sarah, died of fever near 6 years back. He rarely came to town, and when he did, he spoke little and left quickly. Hendricks blinked. "Mr. Kane? You bidding?" "250's the offer." Thomas Kane stopped before the platform, ignoring Hendricks and the grumbling crowd. He looked directly at Mei Ling. His voice, when he spoke, was low, gravelly, but it cut through the murmurs like a knife. "No." Hendricks sputtered. "No? What you mean, no? You ain't bid." Thomas kept his gaze on Mei Ling. There was an intensity there, a quiet assessment that made her want to shrink, yet also held her rooted. "I offer marriage," he stated, the words falling into sudden, stunned silence. "Not coin. My name. Kane." A collective gasp sucked the air from the square. Marriage? To a Chinese girl? Hendricks' jaw dropped. The tobacco-stained man sneered. "Marriage? Hell, Kane, you gone soft in the head? Or just lonely out there on that spread of yours?" More nervous laughter followed, tinged with disbelief and a thread of hostility. Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the speaker. His gray eyes remained locked on Mei Ling, waiting. The offer hung in the blistering air, immense, terrifying, utterly unexpected. Marriage, not ownership, but partnership, a name, protection, or something else, something hidden beneath his stoic grief. Mei Ling's mind reeled. Escape from the auction block. Yes, but into what? The isolated domain of a stranger marked by profound loss? Her throat tightened. She couldn't speak, could barely breathe. The crack in the livery wall blurred. Hendricks found his voice, sharp with confusion, and a hint of anger at his commission evaporating. "Marriage? That ain't the deal, Kane. This is a labor auction. Cash on the barrelhead." Thomas finally turned his head, a slow, deliberate movement. His gaze swept over Hendricks, cold and dismissive. "She's a person, not livestock. You got a preacher in this town, or just vultures." The challenge's voice was quiet, but absolute. It dared Hendricks or anyone else to contradict him. The auctioneer's face purpled. He looked from Thomas's implacable expression to the bewildered crowd, then back to Mei Ling, a piece of troublesome goods suddenly complicated. He spat. "Fine. Your problem. Kane. Take her. Ain't worth the trouble." He made a sharp, disgusted gesture. "Deal's done. Get her off my platform." The rope around Mei Ling's wrist was cut with a rough jerk by Hendricks' assistant. The sudden freedom made her arms ache. Thomas Kane simply nodded, a curt dip of his chin. He didn't reach for her, didn't offer a hand. He turned and walked toward the sturdy, dust-covered wagon hitched to 2 patient bays at the edge of the square. The implication was clear: follow or don't. The crowd parted silently now, watching her, their expressions a mix of curiosity, contempt, and outright scorn. A woman in a faded bonnet clutched her shawl tighter, whispering fiercely to her companion. The words unnatural and "poor Sarah" just audible. A miner spat near Mei Ling's feet as she passed. The hostility was a physical pressure against her skin, colder than the desert night promised to be. She kept her eyes fixed on Thomas Kane's broad back, the only point of stability in a world tilting violently. Her legs felt like water, but she forced them to move, one foot in front of the other, the loosened rope ends dangling from her raw wrists. Escape, however uncertain, was walking towards that wagon. Thomas didn't speak as she approached. He merely checked the harness buckles, his movements economical, practiced. His hands were large, calloused, marked with old scars, working hands. He didn't look at her as she hesitantly approached the wagon bed. It was high, too high. She braced herself, gathering her strength to scramble up, humiliation burning her cheeks. Before she could attempt it, he was there, not touching her, but placing a worn wooden crate beside the wheel. A step, he stepped back immediately, giving her space, his gaze now on the distant, hazy mountains. Mei Ling climbed onto the crate, then hauled herself awkwardly into the bed of the wagon, landing amidst sacks of grain and a few crates. It smelled of earth, dry grass, and leather. Thomas secured the tailgate, then walked to front and climbed onto the driver's bench without a word. A flick of the reins, a low command of the horses, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving Redstone's dust and malice behind. The silence stretched as the wagon rolled out of town, past the last dilapidated shacks, and onto the open trail, winding into the scrubland and rising hills. Mei Ling sat huddled against a sack, the worn wood ruff against her back. She watched Thomas Kane's back, straight, unyielding. What drove a man like him to do such a thing? Pity? A sudden madness? Or was it the crushing weight of his own solitude, seeking any port in the storm, even one as strange and broken as her? A fleeting image surfaced in his mind, prompted by the quiet rhythm of the wagon. Sarah's laugh, bright as sunlight on snowmelt, a sound silenced forever. The hollow ache beneath his ribs, a familiar companion, tightened its grip. This was different, not replacement. A debt paid forward, a shield raised against the world's cruelty? He couldn't name it. He only knew he couldn't leave her to Hendricks and his 250 bidders. The landscape unfolded, vast, harsh, beautiful in a way that stole the breath and instilled deep unease. Saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against the bleached sky. Red rock formations, carved by wind and time, jutted from the earth. The trail climbed steadily, the air growing marginally cooler but thinner. Thomas didn't look back, didn't speak. He simply drove, the creak of the wagon and the clop of hooves, the only sounds. Mei Ling wrapped her arms around herself, the defiance that had held her upright on the platform leaching away, replaced by a profound exhaustion and a gnawing fear of the unknown. Where was he taking her? What did he truly expect? The silence fell heavy, expectant. Hours passed. The sun began its descent, painting the western sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple. They turned off the main trail onto a rougher track that wound to a stand of pinyon pines, the scent sharp and resinous. Then, the land opened up again into a high valley. Thomas Kane reined in the horses. "Home," he said quietly, the first word spoken since leaving Redstone. It wasn't an announcement, just a simple statement. Mei Ling peered over the side of the wagon. The Kane Ranch. It wasn't grand. A low, single-story adobe house, its plaster walls cracked and sun-baked to a warm tan, nestled against a rocky outcrop that offered some shelter from the wind. A weathered barn stood nearby, its timber gray and silvered. A corral held a few horses, their coats dusty. A dry creek bed, a scar of pale sand and bleached stones, snaked along one edge of the property. Beyond, the land stretched out, grasslands dotted with sagebrush, rolling up the distant pine-covered hills. It was isolated, utterly. The silence here was deeper, broken only by the sigh of the wind in the pines and the restless shifting of the horses in the corral. Thomas climbed down and walked to the back of the wagon. He lowered the tailgate. This time, he did look at her, even get down. He didn't offer help, but he waited, patient. Mei Ling climbed down, her legs stiff and trembling. The dust of the journey coated her skin, her dress. She stood uncertainly in the yard, taking it in. The isolation was overwhelming. No neighbors in sight. Just this man, this house, this vast, empty land. Thomas moved past her towards the house. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning a protest, and disappeared inside for a moment. He returned carrying a dented tin cup. He walked to a rain barrel beside the house, dipped the cup in, and brought it back, holding out to her. Water sloshed clear and cool inside. "Drink," he said, his voice still low, but without command. An offering. Mei Ling stared at the cup, then at his face. The lines seemed deeper in the fading light, the gray eyes watchful, unreadable. Hesitantly, she reached out and took the cup. Her fingers brushed his callous ones for an instant. She flinched back slightly, but he didn't react. She raised the cup to her lips. The water was cold, tasting faintly of wood and sky. It was the first kindness freely given since she couldn't remember. She drank deeply, the coolness a shock to her parched throat. Thomas watched her drink, then gestured towards the open door. "There's a room. Back was storage. You can have it." He paused, as if searching for words that wouldn't come easily. "Ain't much, but it's yours." He didn't move to usher her inside. He just stood there, a solitary figure in the gathering twilight, the empty cup in her hands the only fragile bridge between them. Mei Ling looked from him to the dark rectangle of the doorway. Hers. The word echoed strangely. She took a tentative step toward the house, then another. As she crossed the threshold, the smell of the interior hit her. Old wood, dried herbs, dust, and beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, the lingering scent of coal oil from a lamp. And something else. A sound, faint, rhythmic. Scritch, 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 like claws on wood, coming from the shadows at the far end of the main room, near the doorway to the back. She froze, the cup forgotten in her hand, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. What lived in the darkness of Thomas Kane's house? The scritch, scritch. Scritch froze Mei Ling in the doorway, the dented tin cup cold and heavy in her hand. It came from the far end of the shadowed room, near a doorway leading deeper into the adobe house, a sound like claws worrying wood, persistent and unnerving in the profound quiet. The lingering scent of coal oil, sharp and medicinal, couldn't mask the underlying odor of dust and something else, dried flowers, perhaps faint and ghostly. Her breath hitched, the terror of the auction block momentarily replaced by the primal fear of the unknown lurking in this silent man's domain. Thomas Kane moved past her, his boots scuffing softly on the packed earth floor. He didn't seem alarmed, only weary. He walked toward the sound, disappearing through the inner doorway. Mei Ling remained rooted, straining to hear. A low murmur, Thomas's voice, too indistinct for words. Then a soft thump, followed by a different sound, a frantic, high-pitched chittering. The scratching intensified for a frantic second, then stopped abruptly. Thomas reappeared, carrying a small, rough-hewn wooden crate. Inside, visible through slats, a small, furry shape huddled, a young gray squirrel, its eyes wide with fear, its tiny claws scrabbling against the wood. "Got in through a loose shutter slat," Thomas said, his voice flat. He carried the crate towards the open front door. "Been at it since yesterday." Chewed Sarah's old sewing basket. He gestured vaguely toward the corner near the inner door where a woven basket sat, its rim splintered. The mention of his wife's name hung in the air, stark and unexpected. He didn't elaborate, didn't look at Mei Ling. He simply stepped outside, walked a few paces into the yard, and opened the crate. The squirrel shot out like a gray bullet, vanishing into the gathering dusk under the pinyon pines. Thomas stood for a moment, watching it go, the crate dangling from his hand. Then he turned back, his face unreadable in the fading light. He placed the empty crate beside the doorframe. Shutters fixed now. Relief washed over Mei Ling, leaving her limbs weak. Just an animal, not a monster, not a hidden threat. Yet the sight of the damaged basket, Sarah's basket, left a different kind of unease. It was a tangible reminder of the woman whose absence permeated these walls, a ghost woven into the very fabric of the ranch. Thomas walked past her again, this time towards the cold hearth at one end of the room. Fire needs tending. The room was larger than it seemed from outside, low-ceilinged and shadowed. Adobe walls absorbed the dying light. a sturdy wooden table, two mismatched chairs, a worn rocker near the hearth. Shelves held practical items, tins, jars, a few worn books. A faded calico curtain hung in the inner doorway. Everything spoke of function, worn smooth by solitude. No photographs. No feminine touches beyond the ghosts of dried flowers in the damaged basket. Thomas knelt before the hearth, arranging kindling over yesterday's ashes with practiced hands. Mei Ling hovered near the door, the cup still clutched tight. The vast silence of the valley pressed in, heavier than the town's noise. It wasn't just quiet. It was an absence of life, a profound isolation that made her own breathing seem loud. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwanted. The crowded, noisy tenement in San Francisco, the press of bodies, the smell of salt and fish and too many people. Then the sudden, terrifying emptiness after men came, the silence that wasn't peaceful, but stolen. This silence was different, deeper, but it echoed that same feeling of being utterly adrift. Woods there. Thomas nodded towards a small stack of split pine beside the hearth, without looking up. He struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the strong planes of his face, the deep grooves around his eyes, the gray stubble on his jaw. The kindling caught, small flames licking hungrily. Mei Ling hesitated. Was this a test? An order? He hadn't demanded anything yet. Slowly, her movement stiff with apprehension, she set the tin cup carefully on the table. Its dull clunk sounded loud. She approached the woodpile, selecting a small, manageable piece. Her hands trembled slightly as she held out towards the growing fire, unsure where to place it. Thomas didn't take it. He shifted slightly, making space beside him on the hard-packed floor. Not too big. Start small. Let it breathe. His voice was low, instructive, devoid of impatience. He demonstrated, placing a slender piece carefully atop the kindling. Like that. Taking a shaky breath, Mei Ling knelt, careful to keep distance between them. The earth floor was cool beneath her thin dress. She mimicked his action, placing her piece gently onto the flames. It caught. A tiny warmth bloomed, pushing back the shadows near the hearth. A simple task, a shared focus. No words were needed. She reached for another small piece. Thomas watched her movements from the corner of his eye. There was a carefulness in her, a wariness like a half-wild creature. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, the pop of the fire, the distant call of an owl outside. Sarah hadn't been like that. Sarah had filled rooms with her presence, her laughter bouncing off these very walls. The memory was a physical ache, a familiar hollow beneath his ribs. He stayed on the ranch because it was all he had left of her. The land, the house, the routines. There were threads connecting him to a time before the silence. Leaving would feel like abandoning her memory entirely. This girl, she was a complication, a responsibility he hadn't sought, but couldn't ignore after seeing her standing there, a lone figure facing the abyss. He added another piece of wood. They worked in silence for several minutes, the fire growing steadily, casting flickering light that danced on the adobe walls. The warmth began to seep into the room, chasing away the evening chill. Mei Ling found a rhythm, selecting pieces, placing them with care. It was a small anchor in the sea of uncertainty. She risked a glance at Thomas. He was staring into the flames, his expression distant, lost in thoughts she couldn't fathom. The lines on his face seemed deeper in the firelight, etched by grief and sun. The fragile peace was broken by the sound of hoofbeats, distant at first, then growing steadily closer, echoing sharply in the valley's stillness. Mei Ling froze, a piece of wood half lifted. Fear, cold and immediate, flooded back. Redstone. Had they followed, changed their minds? Thomas's head snapped up, his posture instantly alert. He rose smoothly to his feet, his hand unconsciously brushing near the worn leather holster at his hip, where a revolver rested. He moved to the single small window beside the door, peering out through the thick, wavy glass. Mei Ling stayed crouched by the fire, her heart pounding against her ribs. The The hoofbeat slowed, then stopped outside. A voice called out, rough but not overtly hostile. "Kane, you home?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. He watched, his body tense. After a long moment, he opened the door just enough to see out. Mei Ling shrank back into the shadows near the hearth. "Henderson," Thomas acknowledged, his voice neutral. Jed Henderson owned the small spread bordering Kane's valley to the east. A wiry man, perpetually squinting, known more for his sharp trading than neighborly warmth. He sat astride a tired-looking sorrel, peering past Thomas into the dim interior of the house. His gaze lingered for a fraction too long on Mei Ling's huddled form. "Heard you took on help," Henderson said, his tone carefully bland. "Town's buzzing about it. Hendricks ain't too pleased, lost his commission." A dry chuckle. "Marriage, huh? Bold move, Kane. Bold." Thomas didn't rise to the bait. "Got work to do, Jed." Sure. Just passing through, check-in fences. Saw your smoke." Henderson's eyes darted around the yard, taking in the quiet ranch. "Quiet out here. Mighty quiet. Especially for company." The implication hung heavy. Company like her. Heard some of the boys down at the Lucky Star were talking. Stirred up about it. Foreign wife and all. Might want to keep a watch. He delivered the warning with a casualness that made it more menacing. "Appreciate the concern," Thomas said, his voice devoid of any real appreciation. "Fences are fine." Henderson shifted in his saddle. "Suit yourself. Just thought you should know how the wind's blowing. Even way out here." He touched his hat brim, a mockery of politeness. "Evening, ma'am," he called, loud enough for Mei Ling to hear. The title felt like a slap. He wheeled his horse and rode off at a trot, the sound fading slower than Mei Ling would have liked. Thomas closed the door, the solid thud echoing in the sudden quiet. He didn't look at Mei Ling, but his jaw was tight. The warning was clear. Redstone's malice hadn't stayed in the town square. It could ride out here, carried on the wind or on the tongues of men like Henderson. The fragile sense of sanctuary Mei Ling had begun to feel evaporated, replaced by the familiar chill of being watched, judged, unwanted. Thomas returned to the fire, adding a larger log with unnecessary force. Sparks flew up the chimney. "Pay him no mind," he muttered, more to the flames than to her. But the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. Later, after a silent meal of beans and coarse bread eaten at opposite ends of the table, Thomas showed Mei Ling the back room. It was small, windowless, and smelled strongly of stored grain and dust. It clearly had been storage. A narrow cot with thin mattress and a ruffled blanket stood against one wall. A single crate served as a makeshift table. A stub of a candle in a tin holder was the only light. It was stark, cold, but it had a door. A door she could close. "Yours," Thomas repeated his earlier word. He lit the candle stub with a spill from the main room's fire. The small flame guttered, casting long, dancing shadows on the bare adobe walls. "Need anything?" Mei Ling shook her head mutely, hugging her arms around herself. She didn't need kindness. She needed walls between her and the vast, watching darkness outside, between her and this man whose motives were still a mystery wrapped in grief. Thomas nodded, his face impassive in the flickering light. Doors got a latch inside. He turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. Wind gets up at night, makes noises, branches on the roof. It was almost an apology for the earlier squirrel, a warning for the sounds to come. Then he was gone, pulling the door closed behind him. Mei Ling heard the soft tread of his boots retreating down the short hallway. Alone, truly alone for the first time since the auction block. The silence in the little room was absolute, pressing in on her ears. The candle flame wavered. She sank onto the edge of the cot, the straw mattress crackling beneath her. The weight of the day, the journey, the fear, the crushing uncertainty settled on her like a physical burden. She pulled the scratchy blanket around her shoulders, seeking warmth that wouldn't come. Her gaze wandered the small space, seeking distraction from the thoughts swirling in her head. The flickering candlelight caught something half buried in the dirt floor near the leg of the crate table. Not dirt, something smooth and pale. Curious despite her exhaustion, Mei Ling knelt. She brushed away the loose earth with her fingers. It was a piece of pottery, curved and broken, glaze of faded, creamy white with a delicate tracery of blue flowers painted along the edge. It was utterly unlike the heavy, utilitarian crockery she'd seen in the main room. It was fine, feminine. Sarah's? Holding the shard in her palm, she traced the faded blue petals with a fingertip. It felt fragile, precious, a whisper of the woman who had lived here, loved here, died here. What had happened to her? What had she been like? The question swirled, unanswered. Mei Ling carefully placed the shard on the crate. As she did, her knuckles brushed against something rough carved into the wood of the crate itself, hidden on the side facing the wall. Frowning, Mei Ling shifted the candle closer, holding the flickering light steady. She peered at the markings. They weren't random scratches. They were deliberate, carved with some care into the rough pine. Symbols, not English letters. Not anything she recognized immediately. Angular lines, intersecting curves, a pattern that seemed both familiar and utterly alien. They looked old, and they were stained a deep, rusty brown in the grooves. Like old blood, a cold dread, deeper than the night chill, seeped into Mei Ling's bones. She snatched her hand back as it burned. What was this? Who had carved it? And why was it hidden here, in this storage room, stained with that ominous dark residue? The fragile sense of tentative safety Thomas's quiet actions had begun to build shattered completely. The ranch's isolation no longer felt like a refuge, but a vast, silent stage where unseen stories, dark and unsettling, had played out long before she arrived. The wind chose that moment to rise, moaning around the corners of the adobe house like a lost soul, making the candle flame tremble violently, threatening to plunge her into absolute darkness. The candle flame guttered wildly as the wind moaned around the adobe corners, casting the blood-darkened symbols on the crate into grotesque, dancing shadows. Mei Ling recoiled, pressing her back against the rough plaster wall of the tiny room. The carved lines, angular, intersecting, stained with that ominous rusty brown, seemed to pulse in the flickering light. Not random, not accidental. A message, a warning, a curse? The cold dread that had seeped into her bones now froze her in place. The fragile sense of sanctuary Thomas, Kane's quiet offer, had provided shattered like the pottery shard she found earlier. This ranch held secrets, dark ones, buried like the broken china, but bleeding through the wood. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind to the pinyon pines, became the scrape of unseen claws or the whisper of a ghost. She spent the long hours huddled on the cot, the scratchy blanket pulled tight, eyes fixed on the closed door, the crate of malevolent presence in the corner. The symbols haunted her, echoing half-remembered tales whispered in the crowded San Francisco tenements. Tales of protective marks, of wards against evil spirits, or sometimes, darker things, marks of violence left behind. The rusty stains screamed violence. Whose blood? Sarah's? A chill unrelated to the desert night swept through her. Had Thomas Kane's grief curdled into something else? Dawn crept into the room, gray and reluctant, revealing the symbols in their stark, mundane horror. They looked older, less immediately threatening in the flat light, but the stain remained a grim testament. Mei Ling rose, her body stiff with cold and fear. She couldn't stay locked in this room. She needed air, space, distance from the carved enigma. Moving silently, she eased a latch and peered into the main room. Thomas was already at the cold hearth, rebuilding the fire. He glanced up as she appeared, his gray eyes taking her pallor, the shadows beneath her own eyes. He didn't speak, just gave a curt nod towards the door. "Chores," he said simply, the word a lifeline thrown into the sea of her fear. Outside, the high valley was bathed in the pale gold of early morning. The air was crisp, scented with pine and sage, the vast silence both beautiful and intimidating. Thomas led her to the barn, its weathered timber groaning in the breeze. Inside, the warm, sweet smell of hay and horseflesh was a tangible comfort. 3 horses occupied the stalls, the sturdy bays from the wagon and a smaller, wiry chestnut mare with intelligent eyes. "Morning feed," Thomas stated, handing Mei Ling a dented metal scoop. He gestured towards a bin filled with oats. 1 scoop each. Dump it in the trough. He demonstrated with the chestnut mare, speaking softly to the animal as it nudged his shoulder. "Easy, Juniper." The horse whickered softly in response. Mei Ling approached the first bay cautiously, the scoop trembling slightly in her hand. The horse turned its large head, dark eyes regarding her with mild curiosity. She froze, a memory flashing, sharp and painful. The crowded docks in Canton, the crush of bodies, the smell of salt and fish, and then the terrifying grip on her arm, wrenching her away from her grandmother's desperate grasp. The overwhelming sense of being small, powerless, preyed upon. The horse's gentle snort brought her back. Not a predator, just an animal. Hungry, taking a shaky breath, she scooped the oats and poured them into the trough. The bay dipped its head immediately, the rhythmic crunching sound anchoring her in the present. She moved to the next stall, repeating the action, her movements growing steadier. It was simple, physical, grounding. Thomas watched from the corner of his eye as he forked fresh hay into Juniper's stall. He saw the initial terror, the way she flinched from the horse, the shadow that crossed her face, a memory surfacing, he guessed, dark and unwanted. Then the determination as she mastered the simple task, the slight easing of tension in her shoulders. She was stronger than she looked, resilient, like Sarah had been, facing the harshness of this land. The thought brought its usual ache, but also a flicker of something else, not replacement, recognition, perhaps. Later, back at the house, Thomas busied himself mending a leather harness at the table. Mei Ling lingered near the hearth, the warmth welcome after the barn's chill. Her gaze fell on the damaged sewing basket Sarah had owned, its rim splintered by the squirrel. Without conscious thought, driven by a need to do something, to push back against the helplessness, she picked it up. Inside, amidst tangled threads and a few rusted needles, she found a small bone-handled awl and a spool of coarse linen thread. Silently, she sat on the floor near the fire. She examined the broken wicker. It wasn't beyond repair. Her fingers, small and deft despite their roughness, began the slow work of weaving new strands of supple willow twig she'd noticed outside into damaged structure, using the awl to make holes, the thread to bind. It was meticulous work, demanding focus, pushing the terrifying symbols and the warnings from redstone to the edges of her mind. She remembered her grandmother's hands, swift and sure, mending nets on the Canton docks. Even broken things hold value. Mei Ling patience and care could make them whole again. The memory was a sharp pang of loss, but also a thread of warmth in the cold isolation. Thomas watched her work. He hadn't asked, hadn't expected it. Seeing her bend over Sarah's basket, her dark hair falling forward, the intense concentration on her face, was like a physical blow. Sarah had cherished that basket, brought it all the way from Ohio. He'd meant to fix it, but hadn't been able to bring himself to touch it. The grief had been too raw, the memory too sharp. Seeing Mei Ling handle it with such quiet reverence, such patient skill, unlocked something tight within his chest. He cleared his throat, the sound roughened the quiet room. She made that, he said, his voice low, hesitant, the words unfamiliar on his tongue after so long. He didn't look up from the harness. Wove it herself. Back home. Home, a place that existed only in memory now. Said a good basket was like a life. Needed a strong foundation, flexible sides. He fell silent, the unspoken words hanging heavy, broken too easily. Mei Ling's hand still for a moment. She didn't look up, but she felt the weight of his words, the raw vulnerability beneath the stoic delivery. This was his offering, small and painful, a fragment of his grief shared. She resumed her weaving, her touch gentler on the basket. "It is strong," she murmured, her voice barely audible, the first word she'd voluntarily spoken to him. "Foundation is good." Thomas's hands paused on the leather. He glanced at her then, a fleeting look of surprise and something softer, something that eased the deep lines around his eyes for an instant. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The tentative peace was shattered the next afternoon. Mei Ling was drawing water from a rain barrel when she saw it. A scrap of coarse paper, roughly torn, nailed to the trunk of the ancient cottonwood tree that stood sentinel near the dry creek bed. The wind flapped it like a pale, accusing flag. Her heart lurched. She looked around wildly, but the valley was empty, silent except for the wind and the distant call of a hawk. Leaving the bucket, she approached the tree, her steps hesitant. The message was crudely scrawled in thick charcoal. "Chinaman's whore ain't welcome. Get gone." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. The malice from Redstone hadn't just whispered. It had written out and nailed its hatred to Thomas Kane's land. Chinaman's whore. The crude label stripped away the fragile dignity of the marriage offer, reducing to something ugly, something to be despised. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. They knew where she was. They weren't just talking. She tore the paper down, crumpling it in her fist, the charcoal smudging her skin like dirt. She hurried back to the house, her eyes scanning the rim of the valley, the stand of pines, the rocky outcrops. Were they watching now? Thomas was mending a fence near the corral. She ran towards him, the crumpled note clutched tight. He saw her approach, saw the pallor of her face, the frantic look in her eyes. He straightened, his expression hardening. "What is it?" Wordlessly, she thrust the crumpled paper at him. He took it, smoothing it out. His jaw clenched as he read the crude words, a muscle ticking in his cheek. His gray eyes turned to flint, scanning the surrounding hills with the sharp focus of a hunter. The quiet rancher vanished, replaced by a man whose stillness radiated a dangerous tension. When his voice was tight, clipped. "Just now, on the cottonwood." Mei Ling's voice trembled. He crumpled the note again, his fist tightening. "Cowards." He spat the word. He looked at Mei Ling, seeing the fear etched deep. Henderson's warning hadn't been idle gossip. The threat was real, and it was here, on his land. He thought of Sarah, her bright spirit extinguished by fever. He wouldn't let violence, petty and hateful, take root here again. He'd built this place with her, stone by stone, beam by beam. It was all he had left. He stayed, because leaving meant abandoning her memory to the dust. And now there was someone else to protect. The realization was sudden, unexpected, but absolute. "Get inside," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Bolt the door." He started toward the barn, his stride purposeful. Mei Ling obeyed, retreating to the adobe house, the crumpled note a burning brand in her mind. She bolted the heavy wooden door, leaning against it, her breath coming fast. Outside, she heard Thomas leading the horses back into the barn, securing the doors. Then silence. Minutes stretched, tense and interminable. She peered through the thick, wavy glass of the small window. Thomas stood in the middle of the yard, his back to the house, facing the trail that led down to Redstone. He wasn't holding his revolver, but his hand rested near the worn leather of the holster. He stood utterly still, a solitary figure against the vastness of the land, radiating a silent, implacable defiance. Waiting. The wind picked up, sighing to the dry creek bed, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Then, faintly at first, then growing steadily louder, came the sound they'd both been dreading, the unmistakable drumbeat of multiple horses approaching the ranch at speed. Dust rose in a small plume visible even from the window, marking their progress up the valley trail. They weren't hiding anymore. They were coming. The drumming hooves grew louder, a relentless thunder rolling up the valley. churning dust that hung like a brown shroud in the late afternoon air. Mei Ling pressed her forehead against the cool, wavy glass of the window, her heart hammering a frantic counter-rhythm against her ribs. 3 riders. They emerged from the dust cloud, pulling up hard in the yard, their horses snorting and stamping. Jed Henderson was there, his face tight and watchful. Beside him rode the man with tobacco-stained teeth from the auction block, Clem, his expression openly hostile, a coiled whip resting across his saddle horn. The third man was unfamiliar, thick-set, with a heavy black beard and eyes like chips of obsidian. He wore a dusty town suit and a bowler hat pushed back, radiating a cold, calculating authority. Silas Bragg, Mei Ling guessed, owner of the Lucky Star Saloon, and a man whose influence in Redstone ran deep and murky. Thomas Kane hadn't moved. He stood planted in the center of the yard, a solitary sentinel facing the mounted trio. His hand still rested near his holster, his posture radiating an unnerving stillness, like bedrock weathering a storm. The wind snatched at his duster, but he remained immovable. "Kane!" Bragg's voice cut through the dust and the horses blowing, deep and resonant, devoid of Henderson's false concern or Clem's sneer. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed. "We come to talk sense. About your situation." Thomas didn't respond. His gray eyes flicked over each man, assessing, lingering on Bragg. "That auction filth ain't welcome in this territory." Clem spat, his gaze darting toward the house window where Mei Ling stood. "You bought trouble, Kane. Trouble for yourself. Trouble for decent folk. Decent folk don't ride 3 strong onto a man's land to threaten his wife," Thomas stated, his voice low but carrying clearly. The word wife landed like a stone in the tense silence. Mei Ling flinched inside the house, the crude-labeled Chinaman's whore, warring with Thomas's deliberate claim. Bragg held up a placating hand, though his eyes remained cold. "Now, Thomas, no one's threatening, just stating facts. You took a peculiar notion, marrying that girl. Stirred folks up something fierce. Hendricks feels cheated. Others, well, they feel it's unnatural. Bad for the town. Bad for you." He paused, letting the implied danger hang. "Best solution? She moves on. Quietly. We forget this whole unfortunate business. You get back to your ranch, your solitude. No harm done. No harm done." The words echoed in Mei Ling's mind, twisting into memory of the San Francisco docks. The promise of passage, of work, whispered by smooth-talking men with hard eyes. No harm done. Then the locked door of the train car, the leering faces at stops, the auction block in Redstone. Promises were knives wrapped in silk. Her hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. She wouldn't go back to that. Not willingly. Thomas's answer was a single, sharp syllable. "No." Clem's hand tightened on the whip handle. Henderson shifted uneasily in his saddle. Bragg's expression hardened. "Be reasonable, man. She ain't your kind. Never will be. This valley's isolated. Things happen. Accidents." The threat was naked now, wrapped in the guise of concern. "Wouldn't want anything unfortunate to befall your stock or your buildings. Fire's a terrible thing out here." The mention of fire sent a jolt through Thomas. Mei Ling saw his shoulders tense infinitesimally, a flicker of something raw. Not just anger, but memory crossed his face before the stoic mask slammed back down. He thought of Sarah, not of fire, but the fragility of life in this harsh place. He'd built this ranch beam by beam, stone by stone, with her. It was a testament to their life together. Letting fear drive him off, letting them burn it, that would be abandoning her all over again, and abandoning the frightened woman, trusting his name behind that door. "You set foot near my stock, my buildings," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rasp. "You touch one hair on her head, the next thing that burns will be the Lucky Star. And I won't be waiting for an accident." He held Bragg's gaze, unblinking. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. The wind hissed to the dry creek bed, sharp as a whispered curse. Inside, Mei Ling couldn't breathe. The crude threats, the casual cruelty. It was the auction block all over again, just on a larger scale. But Thomas was standing against it. For her, a fierce, unexpected surge of defiance rose within her, burning away some of the paralyzing fear. She wasn't just cargo anymore. She was his wife. By his own declaration, by the improbable offer that had saved her, he was facing them down. She couldn't cower. Moving swiftly, silently, she left the window. Near the hearth, Thomas kept his Winchester rifle leaning against the stones, always within reach. She'd seen him clean it with meticulous care. Her hands trembled as she lifted it. It was heavy, cold, alien, but it was a symbol, a statement. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she unbolted the heavy door and stepped out onto the porch. The sudden movement drew all eyes. Clem's hand went to his own pistol. Henderson sucked in a breath. Bragg's cold eyes narrowed. Thomas didn't turn, but Mei Ling saw the slight tightening of his jaw, a flicker of surprise, or something else. She walked forward, stopping just behind Thomas's left shoulder, the rifle held awkwardly but pointedly in her hands, not aimed but present. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence, the rifle, her dark eyes fixed not on the ground but directly, defiantly on Silas Bragg, spoke volumes. She was here. She belonged to this land, to this man, by his choice, and now, silently, by her own. The memory of her grandmother's fierce grip as she was torn away surfaced, a grip that hadn't been strong enough. This grip on the cold rifle stock was her own strength now. Thomas felt her presence like a warmth at his back. He hadn't asked for it, hadn't expected it. Seeing her stand there, small and fierce beside him, holding his rifle, Sarah's rifle, he remembered with a pang, against these men, ignited a fierce pride that momentarily eclipsed the anger. She wasn't hiding. She was standing with him. The word wife suddenly felt less like a shield he'd offered and more like a shared reality. Bragg's gaze flickered between Thomas's implacable stance and Mei Ling's silent defiance. The calculation in his eyes was clear. Thomas Kane was a known quantity. Tough, quiet, but respected enough, or perhaps feared enough in his solitary way, that outright violence carried risk. But this changed things. The girl wasn't cowering. She was armed, and Kane clearly wasn't backing down. The cost suddenly seemed higher. "This ain't over, Kane," Bragg finally said, his voice losing none of its chill, but lacking its previous certainty. "You're making a grave mistake. For her sake, if not your own." He touched the brim of his bowler. "Think on it." With a jerk of his head, he wheeled his horse. Clem glared, spat into the dust near Thomas's boots, then followed. Henderson cast one last, uneasy look at Mei Ling and the rifle before turning his mount. They rode out as they came, kicking up dust, leaving silence and the fading drumbeat of hooves in their wake. The tension didn't leave with them. It settled over the ranch like the settling dust, thicker and more ominous. Thomas slowly turned. His eyes met Mei Ling's. The gray depths held a storm of emotion. Relief, anger, a dawning respect, and something else, deep and unspoken. He looked at the Winchester in her hands. "Safety's on," he said quietly, his voice rough. He reached out, not to take the rifle, but to gently guide her finger away from the trigger guard. His calloused hand brushed hers, warm and solid. It wasn't a reprimand. It was instruction. Trust. Mei Ling lowered the rifle, her arms suddenly weak. The defiance ebbed, leaving her trembling. She nodded mutely. "They'll be back," Thomas stated, looking towards the trail where the dust plume was dissipating. "Bragg don't make idle threats. He's got pride. And Clem, he's mean as a cornered snake." He paused, his gaze sweeping the perimeter of the ranch, the barn, the corral, the adobe house nestled against the rocks. Fire's what they'll try first. Or poison the well. Coward's tricks. He turned back to her, his expression grave. "Sarah, she loved this place. Built it with me. Every stone. He gestured vaguely toward the house, the land. When the fever took her after, he faltered, the words catching. He looked down at his boots, scuffed and worn. After she was gone, the silence. It was loud. Leaving felt like leaving her behind, like failing her. He lifted his head, his eyes finding Mei Ling's again. I won't let them burn what you loved. I won't let them drive you out. You hear? Mei Ling heard the raw grief beneath the resolve, the loneliness that mirrored her own. He wasn't just protecting property. He was guarding Sarah's memory and the fragile hope Mei Ling represented. She nodded again, more firmly this time. I hear. The shared stand against the riders, Thomas's raw confession, forged a new understanding. That evening, the silence in the house was different, less oppressive, more shared. Mei Ling stirred the pot of beans on the hearth, the rhythmic scraping of the wooden spoon a comforting sound. Thomas sat at the table, cleaning his revolver with meticulous care, the smell of gun oil sharp in the air. Later, seeking solitude to process the day's fear and fragile trust, Mei Ling retreated to her small room. She lit the candle stub, the flame casting long, wavering shadows. Her gaze fell inevitably on the crate with the blood-stained carvings. The symbol seemed less terrifying after facing down Silas Bragg, but no less mysterious. Driven by a need to understand, to find some anchor in the encroaching danger, she carefully shifted the crate away from the wall to examine the markings more closely in the flickering light. As she pulled it, something small and flat, tucked behind it and half buried in the dirt floor, caught her eye. Not pottery this time. Leather, old and stiff, using the tip of the bone handled, all she'd used on Sarah's basket. She carefully pried it loose. It was a small, square pouch, stitched closed with sinew. The leather was darkened with age and something else. Grime? Something sticky? Her fingers trembled as she turned it over. Stamped faintly into the leather on one side was a symbol. Her breath caught. It was one of the angular, intersecting marks carved into the crate, exactly the same. And on the other side, scratched with fine point, were initials, S.E.K. Sarah Elizabeth Kane. The pouch felt unnaturally heavy in her hand. What was inside? Why was it hidden here, behind the crate bearing the same symbol stained with what looked like blood? And why had Sarah possessed it? The carvings weren't just random violence or ancient marks. They were connected to Sarah. Deliberately, secretly, the wind moaned outside, rattling the loose shutter Thomas had fixed. The candle flame dipped wildly, plunging the blood-marked symbol and Sarah's initials into stark, alternating light and shadow. The threat from Redstone was real and present, but this felt older, deeper, a secret buried within the very walls of the sanctuary Thomas was fighting to protect. What had Sarah known? What had she hidden? And what danger, long dormant, had Mei Ling just unearthed? The pouch seemed to pulse with a cold, hidden history in her palm. The leather pouch felt like a live coal in Mei Ling's hand, its weight far exceeding its physical size. The candle flame guttered, making the stamped symbol identical to the blood-darkened marks on the crate, and the scratched initials S.E.K. seemed to ride in the unstable light. Sarah Elizabeth Kane. What secret had the woman whose ghost haunted this house, whose memory anchored Thomas to this harsh land, buried behind a crate stained with violence? The sinew stitching the pouch was brittle with age. Mei Ling's fingers, still trembling slightly from the confrontation with Bragg, fumbled, using the bone all carefully. She pried the threads apart. Inside, folded tightly, were several sheets of thin, brittle paper, covered in precise, flowing script. A journal. Sarah's words. Mei Ling unfolded the pages with reverence, the faint scent of dried lavender and something else, a sharp, herbal tang, rising from paper. She held the candle close, her heart pounding not just with fear now, but with a desperate need to understand. The first entry was dated years earlier, shortly after Sarah and Thomas had finished building the adobe house. The word spoke of hope, of the stark beauty of the valley, of Thomas's quiet strength. Then the tone shifted. Entries mentioned unease, whispers in Redstone about the foreign woman Thomas had brought. Sarah wasn't from the territory, her Ohio origins marking her as an outsider in the tightly knit, suspicious community. Then came the threats. Crude notes left on the porch. A calf found mysteriously injured. Fences cut. The journal script grew tighter, more angular. Thomas says to ignore them. Says they're just blowing hot air. But the fear sits cold in my belly. Jed Henderson came by today, just checking fences. His eyes, they crawled over the house, over me. He asked strange questions about my family back east, about whether we had peculiar ways. Thomas ran him off, but the look Henderson gave me, pure malice. Mei Ling's breath caught. Henderson, the neighbor who delivered Bragg's warning. His hostility had roots. Then Mei Ling found the entry that explained the symbols. Sarah's writing was frantic, ink blotted. Found another note nailed to the barn door last night. A crude drawing, like an evil eye, twisted. And words, which, get gone or burn. Thomas is riding to Redstone to confront Bragg, but I'm terrified. Remembered old Mrs. Gable back home, wise in the ways of herbs and other things. She spoke of protection marks, ancient symbols to ward off ill intent, drawn in blood for strength. Animal blood, she said, sacrifice for safety. I couldn't wait. The fear was choking me. I took the knife to the chicken coop. Mei Ling closed her eyes, the image vivid and horrifying. Not a mark of violence against Sarah, but by her. A desperate, superstitious act of protection born of terror. The blood on the crate wasn't human. It was a sacrifice offered by a frightened woman trying to shield her home and her husband. She carved the symbols herself, likely in multiple places. The crate in the storage room, perhaps one she'd used. SK, her initials, a claim, a plea, the pouch, containing her record of threats and her fearful response, hidden away, perhaps out of shame, perhaps as evidence. The revelation washed over Mei Ling, a complex tide of relief and sorrow. Sarah had been a victim of Thomas's hidden darkness. She'd been a victim of the same prejudice Mei Ling now faced. Her desperate act, stained with chicken blood, was a mirror to Mei Ling's own silent terror. The carvings weren't a threat. They were a testament to shared fear across time. A sound outside shattered the heavy silence within the room, the sharp crack of a branch snapping. Then another, not the wind, deliberate, close. Mei Ling stuffed the fragile pages back into the pouch, shoved it into the pocket of her dress, and blew out the candle. She moved silently to the small room's door, easing it open a crack. The main room was dark, but Thomas was already a shadow near the front window, his Winchester held ready. He'd heard it too. Silhouettes moved outside, dark shapes against the slightly lighter expanse of the yard. 3, maybe 4. They weren't trying to be quiet now. Bragg's accident was starting. Mei Ling smelled it then, the sharp, unmistakable odor of coal oil. Thomas moved like a cougar, silent and swift. He didn't head for the door. Instead, he gestured sharply for Mei Ling to follow him toward the back of the house, to the small door leading out near the woodpile. They'd talked about this after the riders left, a contingency born of Thomas's understanding of cowardly tactics. If they come for fire, they'll come for the barn or the house corners. We don't meet him head-on at the door. We flank. Outside, the cold night air bit deep. They crouched behind the stacked pinion logs. Thomas pointed. 2 figures were sloshing coal oil against the base of the barn wall. Clem's lanky shape was unmistakable. Another, bulkier figure, likely Bragg's bearded enforcer, stood watch, a rifle held loosely. Henderson wasn't visible. Cowards. Thomas's plan had been simple preparation. Earlier, while Mei Ling had nervously kept watch, he had quietly moved several empty grain sacks and loose, dry tumbleweeds into strategic positions near the barn's vulnerable corners and the back of the house, dousing them lightly with water from the rain barrel. Not enough to soak, just enough to make them smoke fiercely. He'd also positioned 2 old, cracked mirrors salvaged from the barn, angled to catch the moonlight near the house. Now, he nudged Mei Ling and pointed to the tinder piles near the barn. He raised his rifle, not aiming at the men, but high. He looked at Mei Ling, his eyes glinting in the starlight. A question, a shared action. She understood. She fumbled in her pocket, finding the small tin of matches Thomas kept by the hearth, which she'd instinctively grabbed. Thomas fired. The shot wasn't aimed to kill, but to startle and illuminate. The muzzle flash was bright, momentarily freezing the figures by the barn in stark relief. At the same instant, Mei Ling struck a match. The tiny flare seemed impossibly bright. She touched it to the nearest prepared tumbleweed pile Thomas had indicated. It wasn't drenched. It caught with a soft whump, sending up a thick, immediate column of white smoke, not flame. Chaos erupted. Clem yelled, dropping the coal oil can. The guard whirled, rifle coming up, blinded by the sudden muzzle flash and disoriented by the billowing smoke that seemed to erupt behind them. Near the house as well, thanks to the second pile Mei Ling lit. The mirrors caught the moonlight and the flickering matchlight, creating confusing flashes of movement in the periphery. The smoke, thick and acrid, rolled towards the would-be arsonists. Ambush! Braggs and Forcer bellowed, firing wildly towards the smoke near the house. Clem scrambled backwards, tripping over his own feet. They're everywhere. Thomas fired again, this time kicking up dirt near Clem's boots. Next one finds meat, he roared, his voice cutting through confusion. Panic seized the attackers. The combination of the unexpected gunfire, the sudden, confusing smoke screens, the disorienting flashes of light, and Thomas's unseen presence was too much. They hadn't expected resistance, certainly not a prepared defense. With incoherent shouts, they turned and fled into the darkness, crashing through the brush, leaving the coal oil cans behind. Thomas didn't pursue. He moved swiftly, kicking dirt onto the smoldering tumbleweeds, ensuring they wouldn't catch the barn alight. Mei Ling helped, stamping out embers, her hands shaking but purposeful. The acrid smell of smoke mixed with the scent of pine and fear. As the adrenaline ebbed, leaving them standing in the quiet yard amidst the dissipating smoke, Thomas looked at Mei Ling. In the returning starlight, she saw not just relief, but a profound respect. "You held your nerve," he said, his voice rough. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the leather pouch. "I found this, behind the crate." She handed it to him, her voice barely a whisper. "It's Sarah's. It explains the marks." Thomas took the pouch as if it were made of glass. He didn't open it immediately, just held it, his thumb tracing the stamp symbol. He looked toward the barn, toward the house Sarah had helped build, the land she'd loved and feared for. The grief was still there, etched deep, but as he looked at the pouch, then at Mei Ling standing strong beside him in the aftermath, something shifted. The weight wasn't less, but it was shared. Sarah's fear, her desperate act of protection, it hadn't saved her from fever. But perhaps, in this strange twist, it had paved the way to save Mei Ling from the same malice. "She'd have liked your spirit," Thomas said finally, his voice thick. He looked directly at Mei Ling. "I didn't just step forward at that auction cause it was right, though it was. Sarah, she always said this land needed more than just survival. It needed heart, needed tending. After she was gone, the heart went out of it, out of me. Seeing you stand there, alone against all that ugliness, it was like seeing a spark in dead ashes." He pocketed the pouch carefully. "This place, it's yours too now, if you want it, properly." Mei Ling understood. The name he'd offer was real. The protection was mutual. She thought of her grandmother's hands, worn from work, but always tending the tiny pot of herbs on their windowsill in Canton. "Life finds a way, Mei Ling. Even on stone if you care for it." This ranch, scarred by grief and prejudice, wasn't stone. It was earth, and it could grow something new. "I want it," she said, her voice finding a new strength. "Properly." A week later, Preacher Elias from the next valley over, a thin man with kind eyes who didn't flinch at Thomas's request, stood on the porch of the adobe house. The sun, warm but not brutal, shone on the high valley. Thomas Kane, in his cleanest shirt, stood tall. Mei Ling wore the faded blue calico, but she had carefully stitched a small piece of lace, found in Sarah's mending basket, onto the collar, a nod to the past, a thread to the future. There was no grand ceremony, just simple words spoken under the vast Arizona sky, witnessed only by the pinyon pines and the watching horses. Do you, Thomas Kane, take this woman? I do. Do you, Mei Ling, take this man? I do. Preacher Elias closed his worn Bible. By the power vested in me and the witness of this good land, I pronounce you husband and wife. After the preacher left, Thomas presented Mei Ling with a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside were seeds. Sarah saved them, he explained, from flowers back home. Lupin, she called M, said they were tough. Bloom blue. He gestured towards a patch of sun-baked earth near the porch, sheltered from the worst wind. Figured, maybe here. Mei Ling knelt on the hard ground. Using her hands, she broke the crust of earth, the soil cool and promising beneath the surface. She thought her grandmother's planting song, a soft hum rising in her throat, unfamiliar words weaving with the desert silence. She planted the seeds with care, patting the earth gently over them. It wasn't just flowers she was planting. It was a promise to Thomas, to Sarah's memory, to herself, to this harsh, beautiful land that was finally, defiantly home. Thomas watched her, the lines on his face softening in the afternoon light. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He picked up a wooden bucket and walked towards a rain barrel. He returned, pouring water slowly, carefully, onto the freshly turned earth where Mei Ling knelt. The water darkened the soil, seeping deep, carrying the hope of blue blooms against the red earth. The desert side around them, a vast, ancient breath, holding space with her fragile, hard-won peace. Thomas placed a hand, warm and steady, on Mei Ling's shoulder as she finished patting the earth. She looked up, meeting his gray eyes, no longer just quartz, but holding the reflection of clear, hopeful sky. He offered a single word, quiet and deep as the root she just tended. Welcome home.